Hello and welcome to Asia Stream, where we track, report, and analyze the issues and interests of the world's largest region. I am Waj Khan, Nikkei Asia's digital editor, here in New York City. Today's episode, Pakistan's Prime Minister problem. From cricket superstar and international playboy, to a jet-setting philanthropist, to a populist Islamist Prime Minister, Imran Khan's ascent to the highest office in Pakistan has been a remarkable case study in professional evolution. Now, he's in a fight for political survival as he faces a vote of no confidence, which could happen as early as sometime next week, depending on the whims of Parliament. If the legislature votes against him, Pakistan's 22nd Prime Minister will be removed from office. So, how did Imran Khan get here? 25 years ago, in his first election, Khan managed to win just one seat in Pakistan's National Assembly. In the last election in 2018, he finally attained the highest prize, but through a fragile coalition. However, the 68-year-old Khan didn't just become Pakistan's Prime Minister all by himself. Over the years, he made questionable alliances, unsavory but necessary to survive in Pakistan's dirty, raucous politics. He teamed up with hardline religious parties. He aligned with corrupt tycoons. He worked with notorious turncoats. But as he harnessed the power of social media, like no Pakistani politician had before, to construct his populist brand, which he then sold to millions of urban and young voters, the biggest bargain he struck was with the mighty Pakistan Army and its Praetorian intelligence services. The Pakistani military is not a typical fighting force. For one, it's nuclear-armed, has fought 3 wars and countless skirmishes with India, and interfered for decades in Afghanistan through proxy war. It has hedged in the war on terror, partnering with the US on one side, but supporting the Taliban on the other. Today, it finds itself out of favor with Washington, but a rather important player for China, which sees it as a partner to counter Delhi. Thus, the army in Pakistan has for years been called a deep state within the state, a geopolitical entity but also a political animal, which has ruled Pakistan directly or indirectly since independence, taking the fight to its external enemies but also meddling in the internal affairs of the country. However, political realities in Pakistan's robust civil society have forced the military to shy away from conducting coups of late. Rather, Democrats, activists, and media have forced the army to adopt a new strategy of leading from behind through the likes of Imran Khan. But like so many who came before him, Khan's time with the military seems to have run out. Some of his predecessors have been imprisoned, some have been exiled, some have been assassinated, and some have been executed. In the 75 years since independence, not one of Pakistan's 21 prime ministers who came before Khan have finished a full term in office. Now, as he faces a vote of no confidence and a military which seems to have abandoned him, what future awaits Imran Khan? And more importantly, Pakistan and South Asia. We've got quite the show. Pad up for a very sticky wicket. You're listening to The Sound of Asia, streaming in your ear. From Nikkei Asia, this is Asia Stream. Now joining us in the studio to get us started with an intro into the man at the center of all this is Asia Stream correspondent Monica Hunter-Hart. Monica, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So, full disclaimer, I grew up in Karachi in the 80s, so I came of age watching Khan's victories in the cricket ground and hearing wild stories about his scandalous high society adventures with movie stars and rock stars. But please give us an overview of the man for people who didn't grow up surrounded by Khan's face in the tabloids and on TV.
So, Waj, as you know, Khan was a celebrity decades before he ever became prime minister, as far back as the 70s.
Imran Khan has lived many lives. Cricket superstar, playboy, politician.
Pakistan didn't have rock stars, but they had Imran Khan.
His fame started in his cricket days. He grew up between Lahore and England, gaining acclaim for his skills at the game while at Oxford and also garnering a reputation as a jet-setting sex symbol. He was known for breaking the hearts of stars and heiresses around the world, as well as setting sporting records. He retired from cricket after his greatest sporting achievement, which was victory at the World Cup in 1992. It was the only time Pakistan ever won that championship.
You don't have to rub it in, Monica.
I'm just saying it was a significant milestone that made Khan an even more significant figure.
Of course.
He used the power of that against-all-odds victory to propel himself into politics. He also made even more of a name for himself by launching into philanthropy and building important infrastructure for battling cancer in Pakistan. So he goes from playing cricket to trying to fight cancer to then, in 1996, entering politics. He starts his own party, the PTI, or the Movement for Justice, which vowed to fight corruption. But he remained on the margins of politics for more than a decade, until finally and controversially, he built up enough momentum and support to eventually be elected prime minister in 2018. I think one entertaining way to track his political career is actually through his nicknames.
That's actually true. So in the early years, I remember he used to be called Im the Dim. I've heard he didn't like that particular nick.
Yeah, I don't think he would have. That was when he was sort of seen as gentle and naive.
Right.
It was back when he had a more humanistic philosophy. He was against the military dictator Musharraf, against nuclear weapons, and often supported minority rights. Much later, he started openly supporting the Taliban, so he was Taliban Khan.
I remember the Taliban Khan days when he was proposing formal relations with the Afghan insurgents, but now he's called U-turn Khan.
Yeah, I think that one's kind of funny. It's because of all of his policy reversals. His politics have definitely shifted towards the right. Now he embraces a kind of conservative populism. He's also evolved into a hardcore nationalist who argues that Pakistanis for too long have felt themselves inferior to Western culture, even slaves to it. One can sympathize with that argument, right up until he pairs it with really extreme comments like calling Osama bin Laden a martyr, or suggesting that Afghanistan finally broke free of the shackles of slavery when the Taliban took over.
When you become a mental slave, then remember that mental slavery is worse than actual slavery. It is more difficult to break the chains of mental slavery. In Afghanistan, they have just broken the chains of slavery.
It is quite the turnaround for someone who used to hang out with the likes of Nelson Mandela and Princess Diana. But Monica, let's pivot to the military for a quick minute here, because they're a crucial part of the story, right? I mean, the mighty Pakistan army has always been involved in some level of national politics, recurrently staging coups and directly ruling the country as recently as 2008. Now, their support for Imran Khan over the years was seen as one of the reasons he was able to become prime minister in the first place. Of course, we also have to note that Khan's win was contested by the opposition, which instead of calling him prime minister-elect in the early days, started calling him prime minister-select.
While his supporters have been celebrating across the country, his victory has been overshadowed by accusations of voting irregularities.
Now, the military and Khan have tended to align on many things. Supporting the Taliban, for example, is one of those things. But if the military was still supporting Khan right now, he probably would be fairly insulated from the opposition's bid to remove him. But that isn't the case anymore.
No, it's not. The army seems to have withdrawn its support for Khan. In terms of why, well, it's both about internal politics and great power politics. Internally, there's a bunch of palace intrigue. The military sees Khan as interfering in its highly sensitive hierarchy. In the larger scheme of things, the military has close connections to the US and is frustrated with how extreme some of Khan's anti-West rhetoric and actions have become.
And one of the most blatant recent examples of that was Khan's visit to Russia on the exact day that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Guess who is visiting Moscow? Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. But the timing could not have been worse.
Many people looking at it would look at the optics of the Pakistani Prime Minister sitting with Vladimir Putin and beaming to the cameras.
Pakistan is facing pressure to issue a condemnation of Russia over its invasion of Ukraine.
Khan and his foreign office haven't condemned Russia's invasion. And beyond all of that, Khan is also under fire for failing to fix Pakistan's crippling debt crisis and not even making a dent to fight the country's inflation, which is the highest in South Asia, or even delivering on his campaign promise of fighting corruption. Instead, he's mostly just been targeting his own political opponents. So all of that brings us to Khan's potential ouster this week.
What is happening in Pakistan is Imran Khan on his way out.
Imran Khan is facing a no-confidence motion. But unlike earlier bouncers in his political career, the former cricketer is struggling to duck this one.
Well, it looks like it's going to be a messy few days. Monica Hunter-Hart, thanks for catching us up on the basics before we move into our deeper dive.
Sure thing, Waj.
220 million people, one of the world's youngest populations. Rising inflation, rising debt, rising extremism. A complicated and corrupt multi-party system, a very tough neighborhood, and nuclear weapons. Pakistan is not an easy place to govern, much less when you're facing a vote of no confidence. To help us investigate Pakistan's perpetual prime minister problem, I am joined by an esteemed group of Pakistan watchers from Washington, D.C. First up is Madhya Afzal. She's a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings and the author of Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society and the State. She has previously worked as an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. Madhya, welcome to Asia Stream.
Thanks for having me.
And then there's Uzair Yunus, who is now becoming an old Asia Stream hand in his second appearance. To remind everyone, he is the director of the Pakistan Initiative at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the manager for engagement and strategy at the Miri, an innovation firm helping companies align their business competencies with public good needs. And he's the host of one of my favorite Pakistanomy podcasts.
Pleasure to be here, Raj.
All right. And then there's, of course, last but not least, there's Asfandiyar Mir. He's a senior expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace and affiliate with Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He is one of my go-to sources when it comes to understanding South Asian terrorism. Asfandiyar Mir, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Vijay.
All right, so this is going to be literally the Shakespearean three-act tragedy with all three of you. What's happening, why is it happening, and what's going to happen? Madhi, I'm going to start with you. Procedurally, please lay it out for us. Tell us who the players are. There's Khan, of course. There's the military establishment. There's the opposition. And then there's the 220-odd million people in Pakistan. Give us the 101 here real quickly. What's the issue here and what's at stake?
There are a number of moving sort of factors at play. The first is that there are these dissenting lawmakers from within Khan's own party that have indicated their frustration with him. Then there's the matter of the allied parties, three of them in particular, which have also indicated their frustration with Khan's government. And these allied parties basically are separate parties, but they are part of the ruling party coalition. You know, in Pakistan, the majority party, the ruling party basically comes into power with such, a weak plurality that they need coalition partners to form a majority. And so that's where these allied parties come in. So, three of them have threatened, to basically move away. So there's that matter. We don't quite know where these folks will fall right now because they're sort of still dithering. Then there's the matter of the Supreme Court, which Khan's government has asked to give an opinion on whether dissenting ruling party lawmakers can actually, whether they can actually cast a vote against Khan in the National Assembly. Khan's party contends that there is that the Constitution does not allow them to do so, though lawyers and constitutional experts contend that it does. So there's a Supreme Court. And then, of course, underlying all of this is the matter of Khan's relationship with the establishment, which is really sort of, Pakistan speak for the military. And that relationship seems to have cooled in recent weeks and months. And there's a question of sort of the establishment remaining neutral in where this ends up going. We think will be defined by where the establishment is leaning.
Wow, that's a long menu of players over there. But I'm going to let you start with the opposition here and the parliament, Uzair. Madhia's laid it out for us, but I want you to pull on that particular political strand of no confidence motions. Now, from what I understand, no confidence motions usually happen over major policy disagreements, or there's a major bid for reform and that goes south. But Pakistan has faced, in the last couple of decades, Pakistan has faced more indeed, one in 1989 and one in 2006. Both have failed. So tell us, from the parliamentary perspective, what went south here?
So I think there's a couple of things that were not set up right for him. Many people refer to his government as hybrid regime, although I would contend that almost every government in Pakistan, democratically elected or not, has been a hybrid of sorts, where it has been brought to power either by the tacit or the implicit support of the military. Khan, when he came to power, is perhaps the weakest prime minister to be elected by parliament since the end of the dictatorship under General Musharraf in 2007-8. And so he had odds stacked against him. And I think over the last 3 years, the fundamental mistake he's made is twofold. One is that he has not empowered parliament. There's the famous opening speech, so to speak, that he gave in parliament, and the opposition hounded him, and that left a sour taste in his mouth. And while his party was promising that they would have a monthly question and answer session, such as what happens in England, he really failed to empower parliament and make parliament his own dominant battlefield, so to speak. The second mistake that he made over the last 3.5 years was he did not keep his enemies as close as he should have, including those within the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf or his allied parties. So instead of dealing with them and building a relationship from a position of strength, now Khan finds himself being abandoned by either dissenters within his party or allies who are engaging in negotiations with the opposition. And what Khan is quickly finding out is that he does not have the strength of the parliament or his own party behind him to sort of stand up and say, I am still prime minister and I'm confident in my victory. And I think being the weakest prime minister to be elected in recent years really is a major handicap that should not be underestimated. However, I would also say that in Pakistan's history, neither a prime minister has completed a 5-year term, nor has he or she ever been ousted in a vote of no confidence. So either way, this will be a historic moment in Pakistan's floundering and flawed democracy. But Khan ultimately will find that even if he survives, the fact that he has not empowered parliament will be his greatest weakness moving forward.
Asfander Amir, this one's for you. Did he really need to engage Parliament when, of course, he had 650,000 uniformed Pakistan military soldiers, sailors, and airmen behind him? Of course, the Pakistani military is the 6th largest in the world. It's nuclear armed. Out of that, the Pakistan Army is the dominant, influential institution. But Khan came in, he was quite tight with the Pakistani military, and one particular man comes to mind, of course, General Qamar Javed Bajwa, the 16th Army Chief of Pakistan. They were quite tight. They were hanging out a lot together. They were seen at military parades together. They met a lot. According to insider information, they were getting along fine. So how has this break with the military, Bajwa's still around, there hasn't been a change of the guard, how has this break with the military happened now? Why has, as Madhya was saying, why has the military lost interest? Why has it cooled on Khan?
Vaj, I agree. I think Khan's predicament is inseparable from his controversial rise to power in the 2018 election. I think it was manipulated to ensure Khan's victory by the Pakistani military. And as you note, after the election, the military was keen on helping him out. It played a major part in helping Khan consolidate his grip over power. Despite being weak inside the parliament, the military helped him in cobbling a winning parliamentary coalition, in managing the media, especially parts of the media which were critical of Khan and which would point out the military's role in helping him gain power, and then passing critical legislative votes. Even there, the military and the intelligence services played a key part. But then, I think starting 2020, late 2020, early 2021, we get indications that the relationship between the military and Khan was sovereign. It was going south. And as you note, the key interlocutor in that equation, in that relationship, was the army chief. The army chief, Qamar Bajwa, he was initially unhappy with some domestic political things that Khan did. This is now mostly on the record. The army chief was unhappy with Khan's pick for the chief minister of Pakistan's largest province, Punjab. Bajwa really disliked that man, still dislikes that person, wanted Khan to replace him, but Khan refused to do that. But the bigger problem appears to be, and I think this is still being explored in the commentary on Pakistan, and that was over foreign policy. Now, ironically, despite leading an institution which has traditionally been a source of hawkish foreign policy preferences, in Pakistan, the army chief Bajwa seems to have wanted a more conciliatory approach towards the United States and India. And on the US, this was in the backdrop of the war in Afghanistan and the war coming to a close, and Bajwa wanting to start things afresh, really reset that relationship. And then on India, it appears that Bajwa wanted to bring the level of hostility down. He's had a back channel with the Indians, in which he's made some concessions, like sort of reining in some of Pakistani proxy elements in operating in parts of Indian Kashmir and other parts of India. He's really brought the violence levels down, or so he claims to his Indian interlocutors. Khan, on the other hand, appears to have wanted a more populist foreign policy. He's leaned into traditional anti-American and anti-Indian narratives in Pakistan, and that has managed to sow major discord between the two. Ultimately, however, where this relationship appears to have snapped is on the eve of the appointment of the chief of intelligence last year. Khan liked this last chief of intelligence that he had. His name is General Faiz Hamid. Khan wanted to retain him. He appears to want to replace him with Bajwa later in the year, but Bajwa wanted Faiz gone, and Khan and Bajwa sparred over that appointment. Ultimately, Bajwa had his way, but it seems like he's not forgotten Khan's insistence on retaining Faiz.
And Vaj, really quickly, if I may add, on Asfandiar's point on India in particular, it's also the fact that the way decision making has occurred under this government led by Khan has been a constant source of embarrassment. And I'll just give you one example. In early 2021, the Commerce Ministry says Pakistan is about to begin buying Indian cotton and sugar. And at that time, sugar prices were escalating in Pakistan, so it made sense. But then the Prime Minister backtracked on this. And those have been sources, they're fleeting moments, but they indicate and sort of evidence that frustration has been mounting, because they're a constant source of embarrassment, not only for Pakistan as a country and as a government, but also for the military establishment, because they're the ones who allegedly brought him to power.
Right. Well, his impulsiveness has been a question mark, Uzair, but I want to bring it back to Madiha real quickly, because after Asfandiar's draw out, especially of that last bit, Madiha, the palace intrigue, why is it that the appointment of one man in this, yes, it is the perfect storm. There's different factors in play here, as you pointed out, but the appointment of one general in particular seems to be really ready to roil the world's sixth largest country into political mayhem. Draw it out for us within the larger context, if you can. Is that what this is all about? Is this about personal relationships between the brass and Khan?
Well, General Faiz Hamid, the former DG ISI, is known to be loyal to Khan, and the contention is that he did in fact help in sort of the behind the scenes wheeling and dealing that helped Khan come to power. Now 3.5 years ago, sort of just post that election, I wrote a piece titled "Did Imran Khan win a dirty election," as some were calling it, or a real mandate? And I think the question, is little doubt that there was interference, right? There was interference. There was interference in terms of getting independent lawmakers to come over to Khan's side. This kind of horse trading, people moving from one political party to the other, depending on where the political winds happen to be sort of blowing, is something that is a given, unfortunately, in Pakistani politics. So, there was interference. On the other hand, I think Khan does have a popular base, right? His populist kind of brand of politics does appeal to a segment in Pakistan's population, in particular the youth. The story is one of a combination of the popularity of Khan, yes, but interference as well, which led to this kind of on the same page regime, if you will, where the civilian and military sides appear to be on the same page. Now, many of us had said at that point, right, they can start off on the same page, but at some point the cracks are going to start emerging. And we saw that repeatedly, of course, since 2018, but the cracks managed to be papered over by Khan, by Bajwa. Khan's brand of politics, and this has been touched upon in the previous discussion, is an antagonistic one. He's antagonized the opposition. He's antagonized elements of his own party, leading to the dissenting lawmakers. But he's now also antagonizing, sort of opening up this front in many ways with the military. In recent days, for instance, he said something that many have sort of been shocked at, which is when the military has said that they have a neutral stance towards what's going on in politics, he very pointedly, basically, in a speech said, human beings side with good or evil, and they side with good. Only animals remain neutral. And that's considered a pointed dig at the military.
Wow, that's really, really inside baseball. But I'm curious how policy in Pakistan is being framed around rhetoric, appointments, and frankly, ego. But Uzair Yunus, this is about the economy. And you said something about India. Firstly, it's quite strange that an elected prime minister has a harder stance on trade with India versus a general in the Pakistani army. I find that quite strange, and I'm wondering what you think of that. But the larger question is, the people of Pakistan have been polled recently. There's a poll by Gallup. Most of the people of Pakistan think that the biggest problem in that country is inflation. And that is what the opposition is harping on about as well, that Khan's economic policies have failed. Now, do you think that there is economic justification there? Forget the generals and forget the hubris and forget the high-handedness and the confrontationalism which has come with Khan and his personality. Let's talk about the dollars and cents here. Has he failed economically, and does the opposition have a case here to make against him?
Well, the opposition most certainly has a case, and I'll just give you a data point to put things in perspective. Since January 2020, the rate of food inflation in India has been roughly 7%. And during that same period, food inflation in Pakistan has increased by 23%. So orders of magnitude higher in Pakistan, even though it was India that had a much more tragic experience with the pandemic, even though it were Indian farmers who were protesting and blocking New Delhi over proposed reforms. So yes, inflation is a problem. Economic mismanagement is definitely a problem. But we also have to contextualize things over the fact that when Khan came into power, the economy was in a state of crisis. It had to go to the IMF, and then the pandemic came around. And at that time, I even wrote that if you measured the early response to the pandemic from just an economic lens, Pakistan's bailout or Pakistan's stimulus plan, so to speak, was perhaps the most aggressive and the most effective in curbing the economic impact of the pandemic in the subcontinent. However, the continuous issues related to Pakistan's economy structurally have not been resolved by this government. In fact, I would argue in some places they've been exacerbated, for example, through perhaps the longest ever real estate amnesty scheme in the country's history, which allows the rich and the privileged to whitewash their illicit wealth by buying real estate and property. And all of that has been done through the argument that this is going to create jobs and promote industry and construction services, etc. However, within that context, if you then say, okay, is it their economic justification to get rid of Khan? I don't think so. I think that if the economy is the only argument, then perhaps the opposition and the establishment ought to wait another 12 to 16 months and let the electorate vote and see how they judge Khan in terms of his overall performance. There is no major reform that Khan has failed at in parliament. There is nothing that is going on strategically in the economic domain that has caused controversy, that says parliament has lost faith in the prime minister. And so I don't think this is about economics. And you can see that it's not about economics because none of the opposition parties, including the two largest ones, the Pakistan People's Party and the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, it's not that they've published white papers or policy documents about what is it that they want to fix with the economy after getting rid of Khan. If economy was of so much importance, then perhaps they should also come out with an agenda that says here's how they would distinguish themselves from Khan and turn the tide when it comes to the economy.
Right. And Asfan, they are from the butter to the guns. Really, this is Pakistan after all. This is the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which has borders with the following: Afghanistan, Iran, India, China. This is a rough neighborhood. The war on terror isn't over. Afghanistan is still the humanitarian crisis there, as well as the developing situation as far as security is concerned. It's still evolving. Just because the war finished on American media or mainstream media doesn't mean that the war is over even. The Taliban are next door. There's been a rise of attacks in Pakistan by groups affiliated with the Afghan Taliban. The Chinese and the Indians are facing off in the Himalayas. If something happens there, like it did in 2020, Pakistan might have to participate in one way or the other. Of course, and let's be honest, this is one of the fastest growing nuclear arsenals in the world, one of the biggest armies in the world pitted against another major army in the world. I'm talking about the Indian military, of course. That ain't over. So there's a rough neighborhood argument here as well. Please point us in the right direction as far as the spillout, the security spillout and fallout, where that is going while all of us are watching the parliament, what's happening in the provinces, what's happening on those forward operation bases on the Afghan border and elsewhere.
The military, to an extent, pays attention to and cares about its relationship with major powers, the US, China, and of course India. But the Afghanistan question doesn't get the kind of attention, the kind of serious policy treatment it should, and that's mostly because Afghanistan policy is completely the province of the military. There's no real discussion or debate on alternative paths. And making matters worse, I think the opposition is completely indifferent to the challenge that Afghanistan poses and the security challenges that Pakistan faces. For one, Pakistan now faces a revived and more entrenched terrorism problem, sub-state violence. The situation in Afghanistan is greatly contributing to that, and Pakistan certainly has brought that upon itself, this really terrible scenario, by supporting this regime change in Afghanistan, the rise of the Taliban. But among specific threats, I'd point to the challenge of the anti-Pakistan insurgent group, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP. It has a safe haven in Afghanistan. The Taliban are supportive of the TTP, and the TTP is looking very threatening. It has already stepped up its violence in Pakistan's peripheries, and it is starting to impose some real costs on Pakistani security forces. Then there's ISIS. ISIS is around. ISIS in Afghanistan undertakes operations in Pakistan as well, and it it recently carried out a major attack on a Shia mosque. And my fear is that ISIS has more mass casualty attacks in the pipeline. Then Pakistan also faces an insurgency of ethnic Baloch groups. These groups are make separatist political claims, and they are looking fairly formidable as well. They also carry out suicide bomb attacks, sometimes even attack the Chinese, and that threat is also going up. And finally, Pakistan has an extremism problem, but one group that I'd point to here is which comes from mainland Pakistan, particularly the Punjab province. It's the TLP, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, and that group has a vast infrastructure across the country. It has some real organic support, and the TLP kind of walks this line of agitational politics, which at times spills into violence as well. And the Pakistani military and Pakistani security services are kind of afraid of going after this group in any meaningful way. So Pakistan faces all of these major security challenges that I fear that the opposition certainly doesn't have the answer to, and even the military doesn't appreciate in its fullest.
Madhya, this one's for you. It seems like Pakistan's political brokers have changed. So where do the foreign powers lie? How are they trying to help or not? And then secondly, the larger question, where does foreign policy go from here? Especially considering Imran Khan was the last international leader seen by the side of Vladimir Putin on the eve of that invasion on the 24th of February against Ukraine. When that invasion was launched, Khan was there. In fact, defended his trip, saying it was an exciting time to be at the Kremlin. I'm wondering, in the midst of these serious foreign policy pivots, Pakistan has historically not been a big fan of Russia. How is all of this going to pan out in this fast-changing backdrop of a global power shift?
So I would say in terms of foreign powers and where they stand on the current political crisis, I'd say the US and Europe are frankly extremely busy with Ukraine right now. So I don't think they really have a clear eye actually on Pakistan and Pakistan's domestic politics. China has been, I think, studiously neutral and really so when it comes to Pakistan's domestic politics. And in fact, all sides in Pakistan, the military and the civilians, and sort of each of the civilian parties have, civilian political parties have a close relationship with China. So I would say that they would be neutral on this. And really, this is, what's happening in Pakistan in terms of foreign policy. There are no outside powers playing a role, much as Khan is trying to pin this on the West, sort of this is a foreign conspiracy. That is not what's happening. Everything that's happening is internal. Khan has embraced this independent foreign policy, which basically saying, look, we're not taking sides here. We want good relationships with all countries, China, Russia, the US. There's a question about whether that is possible and in an increasingly sort of fraught geopolitical climate. But the fact of the matter is that Khan visited China, visited Beijing, for the Olympics, which were boycotted, by the West in a diplomatic boycott. He and Vladimir Putin visited Beijing for those Olympics. Then later that month, of course, as you mentioned, he was seen with Putin coincidentally that day because this was a long planned visit. And on the other hand, we have a US president who for 14 months hasn't called Imran Khan. So Putin called Khan 3 times since August, and Khan was seen with him in February. We know that Khan met Xi Jinping in February, and there hasn't been outreach from the Biden administration to Khan, though diplomatic engagements with the US continue at other levels. So there's been a relative cold shoulder coming from the US at the top level. So what that leaves is actually, while Pakistan says it wants an independent foreign policy, what it ends up looking like is, Pakistan embracing Russia and China and not the West, even though, part of this is a response to a cold shoulder that Khan has been receiving from the West. That being said, Khan did not attend a democracy summit that he was invited to in December, partially maybe because of the phone call not coming through, partially maybe because China didn't want him to. And so that doesn't end up looking like an independent foreign policy. That ends up looking like Pakistan is siding with China. So that is something the military cannot be happy about, right? The military wants Pakistan to have, a good relationship with the US. And so, the military may be fine with Pakistan's relationships with Russia and China, but not at the expense of the relationship with the US. And I think that is playing a bit of a role here. The rhetoric that is coming from Khan, I'm sure is not going over well, for instance, with the Biden administration. One thing I will note is that Khan had, in the last 2 years of the Trump administration, a great relationship with the US because he had personally hit it off with Trump from sort of the 2019 visit that he made to Washington. So I think there are these dynamics at play. His stance towards the West is not immutable. I think it can change depending on how he's dealt with.
Uzair Yunus, this is the perfect storm. There's an economic problem. There's an opposition problem. There's a military problem. It's the perfect storm when you're facing one of the world's most raucous parliaments, one of the world's hardest military establishments, and one of the world's highest inflation rates. Where would you put your finger? Which factor is really, really going to matter in the next few days as this vote of no confidence rolls out? What really is going to weigh in the most?
I think over the next few days, the key factor eventually will be the ability of the Prime Minister himself to sort of put his ego in check, to make the concessions and the compromises that almost every politician and almost every prime minister in Pakistan has had to make, and come to some level of gentleman's agreement with the chief of army staff over the path forward. I think even if he makes those concessions and survives, he will be a weak prime minister who will face a very daunting 12 to 18 months ahead of elections. And I think ultimately in all of this, no matter how this Game of Thrones unfolds, the ultimate loser will be Pakistan and the millions of households that have been struggling first through a twin deficit crisis in 2018, then through the pandemic, and now through rising inflation that just does not seem to want to go away. And in fact, I did not mention this earlier, but Pakistan is facing a wheat crisis in the coming weeks and months. And so more inflation is around the corner. So I think no matter where this ends up going, we're in for a roller coaster of a ride.
Asfande Amir, as far as the second war on terror is concerned, play this out for us. By the time this podcast comes out, Imran Khan may or have lost his seat as the country's 22nd prime minister. What does that mean for the 650,000 man army, which is engaged in what you are currently calling this second war on terror? And what happens in the regional security game?
The political disturbance in Islamabad is going to distract the military even further. The military is controversial enough in Pakistan, and if the crisis continues, I think there will be even more questions about the role of the military, and those questions will not just be asked by elites, but also by common people on the street. I think even they will ask questions as to the role that General Bajwa has played, or people in his inner circle have played, and that will make this this upcoming fight war on terror moniker. I don't like that, but let's just run with it. This second war on terror, how the military approaches it, I think a distracted military will give these militants more space and will really allow them to sort of dictate their terms. I think the situation in Afghanistan is especially critical. This morning, we heard that the Taliban have decided to continue their ban on girls' education. They're not okay with girls going to school. And so I think the Taliban are going to become a bigger problem for the international community. And, Pakistan being their most important ally is going to face more pressure, more asks from the international community. And if the generals and the political leaders are busy with their internal political squabbles, I think that problem is going to be even more complicated to handle and solve. And then amid all of this strategic rivalry is going to play out. I think we are at a crossroads of sorts on where great power competition goes. I think Pakistan should be paying more attention to where the major powers are at, what kind of choices they're making. I don't think Pakistan has quite played out the implications of its attempted alignment with the Russians. I don't think Pakistan is truly appreciating the costs of its enduring alignment with the Chinese. I think, if the competition really picks up, which I suspect it will over the next 12 to 24 months, and Pakistani elites are not paying attention to that, I think Pakistan is going to suffer on that account as well.
That's a hell of a crystal ball, Asfander Amir. Before I let all three of you go, 30 seconds. I know this is difficult, but it must be asked. 30 seconds, Madhiya Afzal, for our listeners. Is this, meaning Khan's ouster, is this going to be a good thing, a bad thing, or none of the above? Something else for the people of Pakistan and beyond?
For the people of Pakistan, the constant instability in its democracy is what has failed to deliver. And I've written about this starting in 1988. Essentially, we have not had a prime minister completing their 5-year term in office. The electoral process basically is not valued as the factor that can actually vote out prime ministers, parties that are not performing, and it's always something else that comes in the way. So at this point, I think we should be clear, whether Khan stays or goes, the Pakistani people are losing because of the built-in instability into the political system and the fact that the establishment continues to play a role in driving that instability.
Was there Yunus?
I think it's most definitely a bad thing. I agree with Madhiya that this constant struggle and strife in Pakistan's elite captured political economy is leading to a situation where the country has gone from having a higher GDP per capita than China in 1990 to being a global basket case. And I think the political elites in Pakistan, as well as the military elites in the country, are doing a disservice and injustice to the millions of Pakistani citizens who have ambitions and aspirations to be globally competitive and relevant. Let's remember the fact that this is a very young country. The majority of the population is under 30 years old. And so this round of instability is only the latest example of the crisis in Pakistan's political economy. And I think a lot more instability is around the corner.
Asfander Amir, you on Khan, is this going to be good, bad, or just plain ugly?
So I'm going to disagree with both the esteemed panelists. I think Khan's downfall will be, on balance, a good thing for Pakistan's democracy. And the reason I say that is that, I think Khan came to capture over the last decade, perhaps more, the Pakistani military establishment's long-standing desire for a third alternative political force to mainstream political parties in the country. And such a force, some generals envisioned, or they appear to have projected, would harmonize Pakistan's traditional national security priorities with discordant domestic politics that they have looked down upon, without direct military interference. Which is why, Khan received all this support from successive chiefs of the military and intelligence to essentially build up his political machine. But the fact that the military is now feeling pressured to distance itself from Khan that they are, rethinking the Khan model. I think it marks the defeat of that model of interference and manipulation, which was, I would argue, conceived after the 2008 transition to democracy. So in that sense, I think this will, Khan's, if he's ousted, and I think that's a big if, but if he is, it will provide an opening. The opposition is certainly not clean. The opposition has played games, is partnering with the military in the current moment. But I suspect that the near-term scale and intensity of military interference that we saw over the last few years will probably come down, and we might have a space for a new political conversation, some new rules of the game. The question is, if the opposition can really capitalize on that opening, and there I'm not that optimistic. I think the opposition political parties have some real weaknesses which they may not overcome. So there's that.
Asfandia Amir, Uzair Yunus, and Madhia Afzal, all from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time. I've heard the weather's turned over there. You guys are getting cherry blossoms out there. I hope to make a trip out soon.
Should most definitely come.
All right. Well, thank you again for your time and for talking to Asia Stream.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wajahat, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Wajahat.
Thanks again to our panel. Just prior to publication, the timing of the no-confidence vote against Khan was unclear, but it seems likely to happen within the next week. Khan has encouraged his supporters to come to the capital and protest if the vote doesn't go his way. The opposition has made similar moves. Is this going to be Khan's January 6, 2021 Capitol riot moment, a la Donald Trump? Groups like Human Rights Watch are warning about the potential for violence. The country's largest journalist association has warned that anti-democratic forces, Pakistan's Speak for the Army, will take advantage of the moment and that this could even result in a coup. That's it for Asia Stream this week. As always, I encourage you to head to Nikkei Asia at asia.nikkei.com for in-depth coverage of Pakistan and all things related to Asia. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share, subscribe, and leave us a review and hopefully a 5-star rating. And a reminder that Nikkei Asia is currently offering an exclusive discount for our podcast listeners. Just type in the code AsiaStream, all caps, no spaces, at checkout when you visit asia.nikkei.com. This episode was produced by Monica Hunter-Hart and Jack Stone Truitt. I'm your host, Waj Khan. We'll be back like a stream come true next week.